Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Cannabis Unlocked. Today, I'm your host, Jordan Euclid, one of the founding partners of Key Investment Partners, and I'm very excited to be joined by Katie Neer of Counsel with Dickinson and Avella. Katie, how are you doing today?
Hey Jordan, I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing fantastic, thanks. Happy Friday.
Indeed, happy Friday. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited to have you on the podcast. Love getting to connect with other sharp folks in the industry, get to pick your brain about all things going on the regulatory side. So maybe to start things off, it would be really helpful if you could walk us through your career history and how you got involved in the crazy world of cannabis.
It is a crazy world. So glad to be here. Thanks for having me. As way of background, like many people kind of especially on the East Coast, if you will, their journey into cannabis is delayed or coming in waves after kind of the West Coast and of course Colorado. Um, and so I worked in Governor Cuomo's office and I did the financial services and general government portfolio there. And so I was there when the medical cannabis law was being negotiated and ultimately enacted in New York State, but that wasn't exactly in my portfolio. It was I was on the peripheral, if you will. But I did have a dear mentor and colleague who was diagnosed with a stage 4 cancer at the time we were working in the governor's office. And so I watched kind of firsthand that policy go from an idea, and a concept and a bill to a law and then an implemented law, and watch my friend and mentor, who at the end of the day was like a VIP in the gov's office, right? Navigate the process to become a patient within that program. And it really struck me how we were sitting within the kind of the mothership, if you will, of of what people call the most progressive state in the country, right? And yet we were clearly rolling out the most conservative and restrictive medical cannabis program in the country. So I couldn't really connect the dots on that one. It really stood out to me and caught my attention as a policy nerd and a wonk and as a cannabis consumer for my whole life. So that's when I kind of got the cannabis bug. I didn't start to get compensated or kind of enter the industry until later when I had a job at a big law firm where I did regulatory work and lobbying work. And I got one of my first clients was one of the multi-state operators, Acreage Holdings. And so
Mhm.
I worked with them in that capacity for a while and then ultimately did join their team and go in-house and work with them on the government affairs team for a couple of years. And
Wow.
um, and then that rolled me into my next opportunity, which was to join a tiny but mighty cannabis tech startup called Lantern. And Lantern was a great company to join, and I think a mission and an idea that I believe will work someday for someone. And the essence of it was basically to be a marketplace aggregator and facilitate the home delivery of cannabis, which is something I still believe will be a winner in the space and critical to the growth and success of the industry. But ultimately, at the end of 2022, kind of beginning of 23, the macroeconomics and the regulatory uncertainty, specifically for cannabis, just didn't line up for that company. And so ultimately, we made that very difficult decision to dissolve and liquidate. And now here I am, just practicing regulatory work in the cannabis space, primarily in New York.
Awesome. That's super helpful background, and you've certainly gotten to see firsthand how challenging the last several years in particular have been for our industry. And so maybe on that front, what are just some of the stylistic differences you noticed coming from a giant, and I'm assuming kind of traditional law firm, right, a little bit buttoned up, versus moving to cannabis in-house, which I know can be quite an opposite culture, right? A little bit more wild west vibe, kind of building the plane as you're flying it, sort of thing.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating kind of arc, if you will. Like I definitely oversimplified in my policy mind, right? The subject matter of legalizing and regulating cannabis, either for medical use or adult use. Just to me, as like a white woman growing up where I grew up, in the neighborhoods that I grew up in, like it kind of like the classic story you hear when you start to get into the social equity and social justice conversations. Like, to me, from my perspective, I knew that cannabis, marijuana was illegal, but I used it, my friends used it. It just sort of existed within my life without consequence, right? So it was effectively permitted or allowed. And that is the story of changing those laws, right? And so to me, when I first jumped into the issue in that buttoned up kind of big law firm setting, I was like, what a fun client, right? What an easy issue. And then I dove in and really kind of had a wake up call where it was like, no, it's actually quite complicated. There's a lot of different dynamics. The politics are different, state to state, even locality to locality within a state, for example. There's a ton of stakeholders, right? Like the issue of legalizing an industry that already exists and pulling it from deep kind of legacy roots into a pervasively regulated emerging market brings this intersection of all of these different policy issues and all of these different decision makers and stakeholders, from banks to unions to your zoning board, your local zoning board, and then of course the community and neighborhoods who have their own opinion and their own relationship with this plant, with this drug. And so it's not simple, it's not straightforward, it is profoundly controversial. And I really couldn't do and practice the way I wanted to practice within the industry in that formal big law setting, right? It just, that the firm and that industry itself of law, right, was just not there yet. And this was 5-6 years ago at that time. So I think that's starting to evolve as the plant and as the issue continues to be kind of destigmatized and people become more educated on it. But that was that tension I felt at that time. And so jumping into in-house within a licensed operator really made sense to me. And that was what gave me kind of this wonderful experience of learning a little bit about a lot of markets. So like, for sure, New York is what I know, right? In and out, up and down and sideways. But being in acreage at that time in like 2017, 2018, until 2020-ish, they were in a lot more states than they're in right now. And so I got to learn and kind of get caught up on what was going on throughout the country. And that was invaluable experience. And I definitely walked away from that with the understanding of like, it's important to walk into any of these conversations, any of these situations in the cannabis industry, and try to respect and know what you don't know, I guess.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'd love to talk to you a lot about New York for sure. I mean, that's been a very important market and has had some challenges as it's moved to adult use. But before we get there, as you think about your experience at Acreage, and then we think about, call it the biggest companies in the markets, right? The, Curaleaf, GTI, Verano, Cresco, et cetera, et cetera. What are some of the biggest challenges those multi-state operators face from a legal and regulatory perspective?
So it's a lot of things. I mean, access to capital is sort of this thing everyone talks about in the cannabis industry, right? And especially in New York, there's a big rhetoric, there's a big narrative right now, right? That these multi-state operators are just like swimming in cash. And that couldn't be further from the truth, right? Like, that, I know that. Anyone who's working with those companies knows that the reality is far from serious cash flows. So the access to capital challenge is the challenge of the cannabis industry, and it exists regardless of if you're a multi-state operator or you're an independent operator within one state market. And that, as we all know, is really driven because of the inconsistency in the status of the plant. So at the federal level, of course, it remains a Schedule I illegal drug on the controlled substances list. And though there's been movement and kind of exciting developments on that front to chat about, it's not changed, right? And there's still a bit of a process that would need to happen for that to change. And so, and even, you know, even assuming the rescheduling happens, that would fix that 280E tax issue,
Mhm.
which would be a big deal and help with that cash flow problem I'm talking about. But it's not like an easy button. It's not gonna fix all these issues. So MSOs have that kind of cash problem, if you will. They
Yeah.
also have a huge regulatory issue because each individual state has set up its own regulatory regime, you know, and structure framework that they need to comply with. And so compliance is immensely expensive for them. It's a cost center. Um, but it's absolutely a cost of doing business, right? They all, you know, in my experience at least, they all take compliance extremely seriously, and they have to. Being a licensed regulated entity is a serious business, and it's very expensive. The third thing I think that's extremely challenging for them is that there's a movement, right? There's a desire as of late to make licensing work and make this industry work in a way that really presents space and time and room for small and mid-sized businesses to be successful, for that kind of homegrown industry to
Yeah.
emerge. And that presents a lot of challenges for the multi-state operators who have made, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars in investments in key markets that are just going to unlock for them at a much slower pace than they anticipated at the time they made those investments. And that's just a reality. That's a reality that the C-suites have to understand, that the shareholders have to understand. And that won't be forever. You know, there is a role for MSOs probably in every market, to be honest with you, but each one's going to look different how they roll it out.
Yep, that makes total sense. So you touched on the rescheduling announcement. Could you, for folks who maybe aren't familiar, could you touch on, what the HHS announced a couple weeks ago, and then, what your personal views are and what the implications of that could be?
Sure. So HHS came out with a recommendation to the DEA to reschedule cannabis down from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. I think that in and of itself is a big deal, just the recommendation, because it was, first of all, it was a data-based, kind of evidence-based recommendation. So it's super substantive work that HHS did. And they're saying, as the federal kind of regulator of health, right? Like, this drug should be on Schedule 3, which means it does have a legitimate health component and purpose, which is a huge deal to acknowledge that. And it has a low risk of addiction and substance abuse. And that's critical. I think all of us who have been consumers or have worked in the industry, we know that. To us, that's a no-brainer. But that needs to be kind of established with credibility from federal agencies and then communicated broadly to the decision makers in DC, right? The elected officials there. And then, of course, kind of bleed down into the states that haven't yet gotten their head around that. And so
Yeah.
to me, that's like the first step of that bigger kind of education process happening.
Hmm.
And of course, if it materializes, right? So if cannabis does get rescheduled to Schedule 3, it will solve that 280E tax issue, which basically means if you're in the business of trafficking a drug that's on Schedule 1 or 2, you're not able to take normal business expenses. And so companies that are running state legal cannabis businesses right now are, you know, effectively taxed, you know, 20 to 30% more than they otherwise would be. And so it makes profitability illusory, really. Like, very
Yeah.
few companies can actually achieve it. And that's, again, regardless of if you're a multi-state operator or you're just operating within one state market. That's a huge problem. So that'd be a huge, meaningful change. And of course, I think the other thing that's a potential upside here is some well-funded, sort of institutionalized credible research on the plant. And I do think if there's anything this industry is craving, it is, data, right? Evidence-based kind of information to drive the policies and the decision makers' actions.
Yeah. And that's been one of the just frustrating and oftentimes kind of seemingly hypocritical, part of the cannabis legalization process is all these regulators who say, hey, we don't have any medical research on it, so we can't change the scheduling. But it's like, well, because it's Schedule 1, which says by definition there's no medical benefit, it's been almost impossible for any institutions to research the plant, right? So it's like this whole chicken and the egg type situation.
Yeah. So hopefully that plays out the way everyone is hoping it will. That would be exciting news. And this industry, like, it needs all the good news it can get.
Seriously.
It's been a tough year. So.
It's been a real tough year, really 2 years. And so what do you think happens next? I mean, when do you think we'll hear from the DEA? Do you have any inside scoop as to what we should be expecting?
So I'm admittedly not as plugged in as some other, regulatory folks and lobbyists in DC, but the people I chat with seem optimistic that something could happen by the end of the year. So wow. I'm hopeful, and I check in with that DC crowd as often as I can and kind of mooch on their intel.
Yeah.
So they're optimistic, which gives me some optimism as well.
Amazing. So then the process would be the DEA provides an opinion and then it goes to Biden's desk to basically sign off on it, or what happens from there?
As I understand it, it's the DEA's the last stop. So
okay.
It's just their discretion, their call. And I think a little bit of independence between them and the Biden White House, if you will. So I think they're authorized to do this on their own.
So then you think it would be some sort of like DEA issues a memo or something that says we've now reclassified it to Schedule 3, something like that?
Yeah, I think of some kind of formal decision and it would be effectuated, as I understand it. And that'd be a big deal. I do think there's probably unintended consequences, right? And of course, it's not the full legalization. It would still remain illegal. It's just on Schedule 3. And it definitely doesn't address the decriminalization issue at the federal level, which no doubt, deserves to happen. But as we know, nothing happens fast in DC. I mean, it's a cluster right now. I mean, there's no leader, right? There's no speaker in the House at the moment. So
crazy.
Yeah.
Either they're on brink of shutting down or they, don't have people in the positions to get things done.
Yeah. So we shouldn't hold our breath for that, but everyone should root for it and work for it and advocate for it. So
totally. And some other exciting developments on the national front, then we'll dive into New York. Safer banking passed the Senate Banking Committee for the first time ever. So that was pretty exciting. What was that, last week, 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, I think it was last week.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
So how are you feeling about that?
I love it. Anytime a bill with the word cannabis in it, and it's not gonna, make the criminalization of it stricter, gets brought up at the federal level, it's a big deal because the reality of who is serving in the US Senate and Congress is like, it's an older crowd, right? And so they just come from a different time and different era when it comes to this plant and this drug. And it takes time to educate people and change their minds and have them view this as something that's not as bad as they were told it was, right? Yeah. So that takes an enormous amount of time. There's a ton of issues pulling on their attention or that are more important, arguably, in their given state or to their constituencies that show up and vote for them. And so to me, anytime there's, an article or news at that federal level or a bill on the federal level is getting written about, voted on, that is all a net positive for this industry.
Totally agree. And I think you bring up a good point, right? Where, part of the reason I think it hasn't made more movement on the federal level is because cannabis reform, I think, has very broad support, but not necessarily super deep support. And so I think that's why it's on us, and others in the industry to really get that messaging out of why this is more than just, a drug that people use to get high or whatever, right? That there are very important implications here, and that it's, it's really a civil liberties fight at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely is. And it's such it's an issue that sounds so simple, right? Like, should it be legalized? Should it be decriminalized? Should it be regulated? And I think clearly the polls show a majority of Americans say yes, yes, and yes, right? But when you dive into the details of how exactly that's done, it gets very complicated. It gets very controversial,
Yeah.
and there's no easy answer.
Yeah. Crazy. All right, well, let's talk New York.
Yeah. New York. Who doesn't
Crazy
love New
state.
York right now? Yeah.
Yeah. Is it the third largest state? Does that sound right by population?
I think that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously very important state. So you talked earlier when we started the podcast about kind of the process to legalize medical. Could you now talk about what that process looked like to legalize adult use and what's happened since that was enacted?
For sure. So the kind of work to legalize for adult use started way before I jumped in to the subject matter. So there were a few kind of key people in New York who have been advocating for full legalization for, I mean, decades, right? And but I'd say it kind of really picked up momentum around like 2017, 2018, and then kind of had some fits and starts, right? Like, oh, it's going to happen. It didn't happen, right? And there's a lot to kind of unpack there and talk about just in regards to the political climate that was happening and kind of driving those ebbs and flows of optimism and then ultimate disappointment. But that's the story of New York almost with any like legislative effort that's so big and complicated. It takes years. So ultimately the stars aligned for the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, which is called the MRTA or MRTA. That those are kind of the acronyms and words you hear people use when they're talking about New York's law. That ultimately was passed and enacted at the end of March in 2021. And it was the version of the law that the legislature wanted, right? And that kind of more of the advocacy community wanted. And at the end of the day, the industry, and when I say industry in that context, I'm talking about the licensed medical operators at the time, fully supported. So, the medical ROs, they're called registered organizations, and they're vertically integrated in New York. They were 100% in support of the MRTA in its final form and how it ultimately was enacted. And that law is super exciting in a few different regards. One is that it for sure embedded social equity and social justice components to a level of detail and prescription that I don't think any other state had met yet. And kind of the two things that were really a big deal on that front. One was a codification of a social equity licensing goal. And so the law says there's a goal of issuing at least 50% of the licenses in the adult use cannabis industry to social and economic equity qualified applicants. And then it defines who can fall within that bucket, if you will. And it's a pretty broad definition for social and economic equity. The second thing that the law did that was a big deal was say that 40% of all tax revenue generated by the adult use cannabis market will be reinvested in communities that were disproportionately impacted by New York's prohibition, right? So New York's drug war, which was a pretty serious drug war, right? We had the Rockefeller drug laws in New York. And if you look at the data, it's just overwhelmingly and objectively clear that enforcement was targeted to Black and brown communities, primarily low income, high crime zip codes. And so there's just a very clear case of that. And so the law says 40% of that tax revenue, no strings attached, reinvested into those communities. And when I say no strings attached, I mean, it's not an investment that has anything to do with cannabis or the cannabis industry. So it's a recognition that those communities that felt the impact of that policing have other issues they care about, and they have other needs, and they have other things to do with that money and that investment. And it doesn't just mean that they want to get into the cannabis industry. And I think that's, that's an important thing to kind of level set and remind folks and your listeners just about New York's law. That is a huge deal. And it is, in my opinion, unfortunate that we're almost 3 years later, we're approaching 3 years later, and we have not seen that tax revenue materialize. And that's for a variety of reasons. And, we can jump into those reasons, but that component of the law has yet to sort of play out in the way I think it ultimately will.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. That's really, I wasn't aware of that provision. It's great to hear that they've kind of figured out a way to hopefully make a social equity policy effective, because I think a lot of states have tried, and it's just, and it's all generally, I think, with the best of intentions. It's just, unfortunately, a lot of times it just becomes, I don't know, it's not effective at kind of righting the wrongs, like you're saying, of the war on drugs, right? Or because capital is so scarce in the industry and it's so hard to operate profitably because of 280, like you were saying. It's like, yeah, maybe you can help a social equity applicant win a license, but if they can't stand up a business, or if they can't, realistically have a business model that is going to generate cash flow, like it doesn't matter.
Right. And New York's law sets that up, right? They set up the opportunity to prioritize social and economic equity applicants in the industry, which is a big deal. And that's really what the regulator here in New York's been heads down focused on for the last 2 years. And there's a lot to kind of talk about and unpack on that front, and a lot kind of in the news and going on there. And then separately, right? It's an acknowledgement to reinvest that money back into the community. It's kind of a reparation, right? And that's what the advocates wanted. And I would argue that is what was achieved within the MRTA. And so the bones and the structure of the cannabis law here in New York are strong and are exciting. And now we're in the rollout, right? We've been in the rollout kind of startup phase here for over 2 years, and it's had no shortage of frustrations and criticisms, and I will totally dive in on that, right? Like there's no shortage of things to talk about, but I do want to say, like, I do have a lot of grace and respect for the regulators and the decision makers, because as we talked about earlier, it's not easy to be in the industry. It's definitely not easy to regulate the industry and try to figure out the rules to issue these licenses and kind of prop it up. And you want it to go right? Like you want everyone you give a license to succeed, but that's just not the reality of business in America. And so there's always going to be this tension and these huge policy decisions. And we're kind of watching that stuff play out right now in New York. And ultimately, they have opened the application for adult use licenses for more or less everybody a couple days ago this week. So that's kind of the big news, the headline out of New York. Applications are live. And the conditional market is still, in the meantime, operating. So
got it. So yeah, let's talk about, why has it taken 2 years, and what have been some of those ups and downs and frustrations in that process?
Well, at kind of that macro level, we did have a change in executive administrations, right? So we had Governor Cuomo step down. We had his lieutenant governor at the time, Kathy Hochul, step into the governorship, and then she ultimately was reelected in her own right for a full term. In the interim there, she appointed the leadership that was necessary for the Cannabis Control Board and the Office of Cannabis Management to get going. And so that was great leadership out of the gate of her tenure. And that team has really been working, I think, around the clock, right, to try to figure this stuff out. So they recognize the need to get some sort of adult use industry rolling as quickly as possible, which is always critical. You do want to kind of capture your consumers, start to capture that tax revenue, change that consumer behavior, especially in a state like New York, where the legacy market is so well established and so sophisticated. You do have to change the consumer habits quite a bit to kind of drive them and convert them over into the regulated channels. And so in an effort to do that, they launched a conditional adult use program. And so that included licenses for conditional cultivators, conditional processors, and ultimately conditional retailers as well. And to be eligible for the supply side, you had to be a licensed hemp farmer.
Mm.
And so there's something like 280 and change kind of conditionally licensed growers and processors in New York. The catch on that was that they have to grow outdoors, which is tricky in a state like New York. We have 4 seasons that sometimes, you have like the fake out fall and then you go back to the summer, and it's just, you're kind of jerked around like with the weather in here.
Yeah, upstate New York doesn't typically, ring of like agricultural farmland.
Yeah, it's tough. It's really, really challenging for the agricultural industry just generally here in New York, and especially for hemp farmers. And then you kind of add cannabis into the mix, and it presents a lot of challenges. And so they've been doing the best they can, and they have an immense amount of product that they harvested in that first harvest. And I believe many of them put plants in the ground for harvest number 2 again. And so we will kind of see how that goes. They are eligible and able to transition to full licenses now. That opened for them a couple days ago on October 4th. So some percentage of them will continue on and roll into the full adult use market. But they got going under the presumption and under the commitment from the state that there would be a retail component to the market rolled out, right? And the state tried to do that with a conditional adult use retail dispensary license and program. It's called CARD. That's kind of the shorthand for it. And to be eligible to get a CARD license, you needed to have a cannabis conviction in New York. And you also needed to demonstrate that you ran a profitable business for at least 2 years. And so that last eligibility factor ended up what is pretty controversial here in New York. So that factor is not necessarily codified in the MRTA. So that's established in reg. This whole kind of conditional retail component was established in regulations, whereas the conditional supply side stuff was established in a law that was subsequently enacted from the MRTA. So that's the controversy. And there's just been an immense amount of challenges with the rollout of the CARD license. And so there are like 400 plus of them that have been awarded. But only 23, I think, give or take a few, are actually open and operational. And that's statewide. And with a population of 20 million people, it's not nearly enough. And so there's a snag in the supply chain. There is litigation now that's kind of freezing that rollout with an injunction. That injunction came in August, though. So there was, from November, December of last year until August of this year, where that rollout really only materialized with 23 stores. There's been a huge access to capital challenge. There's been a lot of challenges on the real estate front, kind of securing locations. There's been just a lot of kind of bureaucratic red tape, I'd say, and on the retail side. So there's a lot of frustration from stakeholders in New York, whether they're in the supply side or they're in the retail side, or they want to be in the retail side, or they were not in the conditional or eligible for this conditional rollout, and they just want a license and they want to get going. Or whether it's your medical operators, right, who have been continuing to operate in the medical space, which, as mentioned, is the most restrictive medical program in the country. It still is. It's really tiny.
It's crazy.
It is. It's truly astounding that, in a state of 20 million people, we have like 125,000 patients. That's it. So
do you have any ideas on like why that could be? Like, is it possible that, the pharmaceutical companies have a strong lobbying power in the state and that's why?
Honestly, I think it's just not been a priority. So I think when the program was launched, it was mandated that in order to be eligible for a license, you had to be vertically integrated and show that you had the access to capital to pull off a vertically integrated shop. And so that resulted in licensees who are these bigger multi-state operators, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately. And
Yeah,
that's
sure.
that's a longer story. Obviously, there started to be New York licenses and then they transferred ownership because of the expense of running the vertically integrated operation and the lack of patience and the barriers to entry for patients and
Mm-hmm.
practitioners. They ultimately had to kind of have those exits to MSOs.
Mm-hmm.
And the MSOs in New York have been kind of keeping the lights on, keeping the operation going, kind of doing everything they can to advocate for things that would increase access for patients, lower costs for patients, sort of beef up the program, make it a more robust, kind of real medical program.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there's been a little bit of resistance to that. I think partly because people have been so focused on the adult use market. That's part of it. The other part of it is there is a really strong kind of anti-RO, anti-corporate cannabis rhetoric and political reality in New York right now. And that's existed for a while, but it's definitely building and building right now because we're coming to the point where those ROs will be eligible to try to transition into adult use. And those licensees I was talking about before in the conditional market feel that they haven't had that meaningful kind of head start to really build their consumer base and build their business in a way that's going to position them to compete and hold on to that business when the bigger operators transition in.
Interesting.
And so that's that tension right now in New York, where it's like corporate cannabis versus the SMBs, and the regulators kind of caught in the middle, and the politics of it all are sort of, in my opinion, oversimplifying the issues,
Yeah.
which is unfortunate. But I do think everything will work out. But I'm an optimist. I always think everything's.
Sure. That's interesting. And in the midst of all this crazy complicated regulatory change and different stakeholders, right? You mentioned how New York has always had a strong legacy market. And in the meantime, we've seen that problem really exacerbate in the city in particular with all these illegal sales of THC and other products. So I'm curious, how do you think about that the prevalence of these illegal dispensaries in the city, and do you see any enforcement actions to kind of help adjust for that?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. I think the illicit market in New York, and it's very visible. It's like in your
Yeah,
face. Go to New York City, but
crazy.
it's statewide, right? Like I live in Saratoga Springs, which is a smaller kind of upstate city, but we have pop-up shops here too,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the biggest threat to any of your stakeholders who want to play ball in the regulated market. And it's the biggest threat to that meaningful tax revenue and that 40% reinvestment in communities hit by the war on drugs, because it causes consumer confusion. And at the end of the day, the kind of the key to rolling out, I think, to rolling out a successful adult use market is about rolling it out with a consumer in mind, not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily your businesses in mind. Business people are smart. They will adapt. They will do what brings the consumers in at the end of the day. And New York right now is really focused on kind of engineering and regulating the licensees and the structure of the market and the way that it rolls out without a lot, in my opinion, not a lot of thought for how it's going to impact the consumer experience. And
Yeah.
so in New York, you have, and I do want to make a distinction between what I call the legacy market versus the illicit market. So legacy market in New York been around longer than I've lived, right? And is well established. And as a consumer of the legacy market for most of my life, it's high quality, it's accessible, it's affordable, it's all of the things you want your regulated channel to be. This illicit market that's in your face in the
Mm-hmm.
in New York City with these pop-up shops, I think it's different. I don't think it's the legacy operators, right? I think it's
Yeah.
people who are and this is going to be a generalization and I'm sure offensive to some, but I think it's people who are being opportunistic, who know we're in this gray zone in between decriminalization and full regulatory rollout, and they know they can make a buck and make a lot because consumers don't know what's going on, right? Like people don't follow this as closely as we do. So they see a storefront that says dispensary, and they walk right in and they're seeing very like well packaged presented product, much of it coming from the West Coast, right? And they think that they're buying something that's regulated in New York, and it's just a massive problem. And the state, I think, I think they may have been caught a little off guard, or maybe they were a little paralyzed thinking, oh, if we crack down on this illicit market, it's a recriminalization of the legacy market, right? There's a tension there. And so I think they were a little slower to act than stakeholders would have liked them to be. But ultimately, the governor and the legislature did enact an enforcement piece of legislation in the state's budget, so around April of this year, and it kind of beefs up the powers of several key state agencies, and so there's enforcement activity underway. I just don't know if it's aggressive enough on the timeline that it needs to be, but it is what it is, right? It's what New York it's the tools New York has to deal with, but it is going to be the biggest problem in sort of rolling out this comprehensive regulated channel. And converting those consumers is going to be, should be top of mind, right, for every decision maker here in New York.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right. And it's the consumer confusion it causes, right? It's the fact that these products are not tested, so who knows what you're getting with them. And then I think it's also economic, right? Like we've talked about, with when you're doing it the right way, you got to pay for 280E. You've got to go through these crazy, expensive, complicated, drawn out licensing processes, right? You've got to pay all the additional compliance costs to be a cannabis business. You've got to, you can't accept credit cards, all this stuff. And then meanwhile, the guy across the street is cutting corners and can underprice you on all those factors.
Yeah. I mean, and if you think about it from an investor's worldview, right? So just kind of take the politics out of it, take the emotion out of this subject matter. You're just looking at the market in New York. I think the illicit market is the thing that's paralyzing that influx of cash and investment the most.
Sure.
Because why are you going to put a bunch of money behind someone who has to go into a super capital intensive, pervasively regulated industry? And these New York adult use regs, they're really strict, right? Like they took kind of all the regulatory levers that you can, and they dialed them all the way up, right? So most states, you see them sort of say, oh, marketing and advertising, we're gonna restrict billboards, but we're gonna allow a lower threshold of the audience to be 21 and up, or we're going to be more relaxed around the canna tech and the marketplaces and aggregators and more creative ways to grow your pie and reach your consumer. In New York, they didn't take that approach. They're prohibiting third-party tech market aggregators to a huge extent. There's litigation over that. They prohibited out-of-home advertising and billboards, and they dialed it all the way up on the threshold of your target audience. So in most states, it's like 70 to 72% over 21. They did 90%, right? So these regs are no joke. They're going to be really expensive, really burdensome, huge barriers to entry to kind of to run a compliant shop here in New York. And investors are looking at the cost of doing that business versus the reality that there's somewhere between 2,000 and 8,000 illicit pop-up shops throughout the state.
Crazy.
It's overwhelming, right? So I think a lot of people are holding their money back and saying, you know what, let's see how this rollout goes. Let's see how this market evolves. And that kills me to say that, right? Like I as someone who works with clients in New York, I want the more the merrier, right? Like I want people to be bullish on New York. I want people to get their applications in for these licenses. Everyone needs a real robust healthy retail part to the supply chain. And I'm hoping that that can get rolled out without further delay, as quickly as possible.
Yeah, us too. And I think too, like you talk about, it's holding up investors from putting money into New York cannabis operators. And I think also just because New York and the city in particular is such a hub for institutional capital as well, I think psychologically, if the rollout didn't have as much complications, then maybe some of those folks would start to deploy into the cannabis more broadly, right? But nonetheless, I think that that's going to continue to play out like you're saying. So I'd be curious, like, where are we today in terms of how many stores are up, like legally selling recreational cannabis, and what do you think the rollout's going to look like for the next 12 months?
So we're at 23 adult use dispensaries right now, statewide. There is a court issued injunction on that's preventing the state, preventing OCM and the Cannabis Control Board from finalizing any more of those conditional retail dispensary licenses. So while there's 400 plus of them provisionally licensed, only 23 have their doors open. I think, the chatter within New York is that there's anywhere from like 30 to 50 to maybe 75 of those conditionally licensed dispensaries that are really close to being able to open their doors if they could get an exemption from that injunction. But that's a very detailed, tedious process that the state's going to have to navigate with the court and with those licensees. So setting that aside for a moment, there's also, in addition to those 23 stores, there's 38 medical stores open and operating statewide. They do not yet offer any adult use cannabis, but there's kind of a path to some chunk of those stores starting to co-locate adult use within their shelves. Maybe sometime towards the end of the year, in the first quarter of next year. The adult use regs do outline a pathway for those medical operators to transition into adult use. And part of that transition would be an authorization that they could co-locate one of ultimately a total of 3 of their dispensaries on or after December 29th, 2022. So that's why I don't think that deadline might hit, right? Like, I don't think you're going to have like 10 other stores open for co-located, adult use sales on December 29th, but sometime maybe in Q1 of 2024. There's kind of a robust transition process, comprehensive transition process these companies have to go through with the regulator. And now general applications are open as well. So this regulator has a lot of work that's about to fly in on their desks between now and, probably at least the first 2 quarters of next year. And so I don't know how quickly this is going to go. I think that there's going to be some administrative challenges, bandwidth issues. New York did, I think the big news with the release of this application is that it's a lottery and arguably limited licenses, right? They put out in the application the limit on licenses they'll award in this round. They clearly said they will open additional application periods and issue additional licenses. But for this initial round, you folks are looking at a lottery process for a limited number of spots. And as we know, when those two things exist in market rollouts, sometimes it invites additional litigation. So I think the hamster wheel of litigation may just be getting started in New York, unfortunately, but that happens in every room. I don't know a market that it hasn't happened in.
Right, totally. Wow. Well, Katie, thank you so much. This has been exceptionally informative, and appreciate all the hard work you and the folks have been putting in getting New York all rolled out.
Yeah, there's never a dull moment in New York cannabis, that's for sure. And I love to talk about it. So thanks for having me on, and I've enjoyed our conversation.
Absolutely, me too. And if any of the listeners are cannabis operators or interested in the space, is there a way that they can reach out to you? And are there specific types of law that you're most helpful with?
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be fantastic. Email is always great. It is kneer@Dickinson, Avella, com. And I definitely thrive in the regulatory space. So licensing work, compliance work, and then of course the legislative lobbying work, which I think will be pretty interesting this coming session. I do think we will see quite a few legislative bills pop up touching or trying to tweak the framework here in New York. And so I expect a lot of activity in the legislature come January 2024.
Awesome. Well, we'll be watching closely.
Yeah, so will I. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Katie, and have a great rest of your day and a fantastic weekend.
Thank you, Jordan. You too.